Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, President Xi Jinping's crackdown on China's big tech firms has wiped off more than $1 trillion of their collective market capitalization. Critics have described the intense probes as stifling innovation, whereas others have praised the communist state's push for data privacy. Henry Gao, a law professor at the Singapore Management University, will be joining me shortly for his take. And in just a few months, citizens from one of the world's richest economies will be voting in a new president. But will France remain left or head to the right? Paolo Piocchetti, a political scientist at the European University Institute, will be providing some analysis from Innsbruck in Austria. Then later, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest company news stories of the week. First, as always, let's start the show with news from here in the UK, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson's leadership is under intense pressure over yet another Partygate row. Earlier in the week, a leaked email from his principal private secretary revealed that 100 Downing Street staff were invited to a bring your own alcohol party in the garden of Number 10 so that staff could enjoy the good weather. The party took place in May 2020. During this time, members of the public were only legally permitted to meet with one other person from another household. The Prime Minister made his first public appearance on Wednesday in the House of Commons in a battle to save his premiership.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise. I know that millions of people across this country have made extraordinary sacrifices over the last 18 months. I know the anguish that they have been through, unable to mourn their relatives, unable to live their lives as they want or to do the things they love. And I know the rage they feel with me and with the government I lead when they think that in Downing Street itself the rules are not being properly followed by the people who make the rules. When I went into that garden just after 6 on the 20th of May 2020 to thank groups of staff before going back into my office 25 minutes later to continue working, I believed implicitly that this was a work event. But, Mr. Speaker, with hindsight, I should have sent everyone back inside. I should have found some other way to thank them. And I should have recognised that even if it could be said technically to fall within the guidance, there would be millions and millions of people who simply would not see it that way, people who suffered terribly, people who were forbidden from meeting loved ones at all, inside or outside. And to them and to this House, I offer my heartfelt apologies. And all I ask is that Sue Gray be allowed to complete her inquiry into that day and several others so that the full facts can be established. And I will, of course, come back to this House and make a statement.
I said yesterday, if the Prime Minister attended this event, gathering, party, whatever you call it, on the 20th of May last year, if he was there after the invite went out to more than 100 people and inviting them to bring their own booze and come to the Downing Street garden, then he couldn't continue. That would have been breaking the rules that were in place at the time. And today in the House of Commons he's accepted and admitted he was there. He's also apologised for that, and crucially for me, he said in hindsight if he had his time again he would have done things differently, and that to me is an acceptance from the Prime Minister that he did wrong, and therefore, to be consistent with what I've said before, I don't believe his position as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party is tenable, and he does need to resign.
It isn't acceptable that he and his colleagues have behaved in the way that they have. An apology doesn't really cover it off, but I don't feel that a Prime Ministerial resignation would really help the nation at this stage. They just need to make sure that they stop behaving in the way that they have been. It's not okay for there to be one set of rules for them and another set of rules for the rest of us.
It's only human, and if everyone looked at themselves, somewhere along the line, maybe there'd be a very small percentage of people who've stuck to the rules. But I'd say the majority of us have broken the rules somewhere not to suit ourselves.
I hope that he would go after 2 years. Well, 2 years is up, and actually he needs to go.
Let's change gear now and focus on China. In recent months, the region has been at the centre of a dramatic clash between public and private power. Anti-monopoly and technology regulators have reined in the might of several globally recognised internet conglomerates, most notably Tencent, Alibaba, food delivery app Meituan and ride-hailing app Didi. Critics have described much of the crippling probes as stifling innovation and economic growth, whereas other commentators have praised the communist state's push for data privacy. Well, for more insight, I'm now being joined by Henry Gao in Singapore. Henry is a law professor at the Singapore Management University. Henry Gao, thank you so much for joining me on the show. We've all seen the headlines, billions of dollars of antitrust fines, tightened cybersecurity roles and severe offshore IPO probes. What's gone wrong in what was once a very enviable tech sector in China?
Well, you see that China has stepped up its regulatory crackdowns on its tech companies, and this is for a variety of reasons. One is that the Chinese government believes that some of the tech companies has become too big, too powerful, and also they are concerned with potential data breaches, privacy considerations, and also the issue concerning data security and national security.
Yeah, I think those are the kind of lines that we're getting out of China, though some critics are saying that this is all politically and ideologically motivated. Do you think that's fair, or is that what you'd expect reports in the global north to say about this?
Yes, definitely. I fully agree that there is definitely a kind of ideological and political motivations behind. Last year, President Xi made a big drive for this so-called common prosperity. The idea is that we want everyone to share the fruit of the prosperity rather than just let a few small companies, a small group of big companies enjoy the benefits alone. So the problem is that some of these big companies become too big. It's like a big trees, and the other plants cannot survive under them. So that is why the Chinese government are asking them to scale down so that there will be more room for growth for the smaller companies.
I think that makes sense. And we've seen, obviously, even if you look at some of the Silicon Valley giants, I believe Mark Zuckerberg has been all over the world, sitting in front of regulators, talking about data privacy and laws. But I think the concern from the global community is to do with the silencing. Let's take Jack Ma, for example, a big fan in Africa. He's invested billions into the continent. He went completely off the radar in late 2020. There were so many concerns about them. Of course, he's since resurfaced. Are individuals in China speaking out about some of these crackdowns, or are they too afraid, quite frankly?
Yeah, I think unfortunately that is one of the side effects of the crackdown. You see this chilling effect for the outspoken tech entrepreneurs in China, like Jack Ma. Actually, Jack Ma got into trouble last year because he openly criticized the financial regulators in China. And he was definitely the most outspoken among Chinese tech entrepreneurs. But since he was silenced, I don't think anyone else really came up to fill in his shoes. I think they all went silent. I mean, you saw this massive wave of retirement, early retirement for the founders of some of the biggest companies in China, including, for example, the ByteDance's chairman and a host of others. So I think they feel that the kind of winter is coming and they are taking precautionary steps.
Absolutely. I think it's always fair to strike some balance. We are, of course, an African global channel, so we understand about a skewed narrative. Pretty interesting that Financial Times, of all the publications, said that, China's become a surprise leader in Asia on data privacy rules. Just one of the voices that are kind of praising China's push for privacy. Is that sentiment being felt in the region too, do you think?
Yes, definitely. I mean, that is one of the reasons for the crackdown. The populist sentiment is that all these big companies, they just take your data without even getting your consent, and our privacy invaded. So that is why the Chinese government introduced this new law, the Personal Information Protection Law, last year. And that is actually modeled after what was the strictest privacy protection laws in the world, including, for example, the GDPR in the EU. But in some aspects, the Chinese regulations even more strict than the GDPR. So I think you do see that China, like you mentioned, according to Financial Times, is becoming a surprise leader on data privacy rules. I think the government is basically in a way riding on this sentiment by the people against the big data companies, and use it to make sure that all these privacy rules would be, implemented, would be enforced, because now is a perfect moment. People do have a grudge against all these big tech companies.
No, you're right. They do have a grudge. But why is it, Henry, that, when the EU tackles Silicon Valley tech giants, they're praised. When it's China, the nation is seen as a boogeyman. Do you think that, the China financial system is too opaque? We've seen that when it comes to some of the fallout for the property sector. It's been really difficult to kind of tap in and scrape away some of the detail to try and find out what's going on. Do you think if it perhaps was more open, people would be more understanding to some of the narratives that are coming out from the mainland?
Yes, definitely. That is definitely one of the reasons, the lack of transparency in the Chinese regulatory framework, which resulted in this, what I would call selective enforcement of some of these laws. So, you would expect the laws to apply to everyone, not just to the big tech firms, but also the government. But if you look closely at the new Personal Information Protection Law in China, actually, there are some really big carve-outs for the government. So basically, when the government try to collect your data and your information, they are, by and large, not bound by all these requirements. And the new law is only applying to the big tech companies. So you do see this concern for selective enforcement, and especially given the recent controversies, surrounding some of the practice of China, for example, in Xinjiang, and also broader, surveillance tactics in other parts of China. So I think that is what has raised the concern. So I think these are justified to some extent.
Absolutely. Before I let you go, Professor, I've got to ask you about President Joe Biden and how his administration may change strained relations between the two biggest nations economically in the world. What are your feelings on that?
The U.S. does not seek to change the economic and political system of China, and China actually reacted to that very warmly. That is why President Xi last November at the China Import Convention, he mentioned that China would be willing to negotiate issues on SOE and subsidy, which previously was regarded as non-negotiable by China. So that is a positive sign, and I hope they could further their cooperation in that spirit.
Well, fascinating insights from you there. We'd certainly got to have you on, and we're going to talk about China-Africa relations next time, I think, Professor. Professor Henry Gao, Senior Law Professor at the Singapore Management University. Thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Thank you. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, I'll be speaking with Paolo Chiocchetti, a political scientist at the European University Institute, about France's upcoming presidential election. Plus, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest company news stories of the week. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a few minutes, I'll be speaking with Paolo Chiocchetti. But before then, here's some company news for you. Rolls-Royce has announced the highest sales in its 117-year history to a record 5,586 motor cars sold in 2021. This is 49% higher than the previous year. Bosses at the BMW-owned firm said there was a high demand for all models, particularly the Ghost and the Cullinan. Rolls-Royce proclaims itself the undisputed leader in the super luxury segment for cars, priced at a whopping £250,000 or above. At least 600,000 passengers cancelled plans to fly from Heathrow last month due to the Omicron strain and the introduction of tougher travel restrictions. During the entire year, just 19.4 million people travelled through Britain's busiest airport. This is less than a quarter of the pre-pandemic levels in 2019 and 12.3% down on 2020 numbers. Heathrow's chief executive, John Holland-Kaye, said the aviation industry will only fully recover when all travel restrictions are lifted. Official data has revealed that job vacancies in Australia have climbed 18.5% to almost 400,000 in the 3 months to November. The government has held crisis talks with industry groups to discuss the shortfall of workers. Due to the surge in Omicron infections, firms in the country's food and logistics sectors are reporting that 10 to 50% of their workers are sick or in isolation, leaving supermarket shelves empty. Arts and recreation, alongside accommodation and food services, had the biggest increase in job openings, rising about 260 and 210% respectively, compared with February 2020 numbers. Now, French voters are heading to the polls in late April. Incumbent President Emmanuel Macron has not yet announced his intention to run for a second mandate. However, he's currently polling first among all candidates. A Macron victory would mean that France would still have a pro-European leader, stepping into the legacy of the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. However, there is growing support for right-wing candidates to be tougher on immigration and security. According to a recent Politico poll, an unprecedented third of French voters say they are planning to vote for a far-right candidate. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Paolo Chiocchetti, a political scientist at the European University Institute. He joins me from Innsbruck in Austria. Paolo Chiocchetti, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Big question, but I've got to ask, what do you think are at the top of people's minds ahead of France's April presidential election?
Well, according to the latest opinion polls, there are two main issues at the top of French voters, the economy and security. So the two main aspects that are focusing the interest of French men and French women are purchasing power and the welfare state, followed by traditional right-wing issues such as law and order and immigration.
Absolutely. Let's take it back 5 years. I do remember Emmanuel Macron, the current president, he was kind of being hailed as Europe's liberal, young, handsome leader to make so many waves of changes, was doing absolutely fantastic in opinion polls. Fast forward today, it's completely the opposite. His reputation appears to have been soiled with labour and union strikes. Some would say pretty poor handling of COVID restrictions. We know the French do like to go out and protest every now and then. Many of them have become violent. There are also lots of cultural complexities. You mentioned security as being at the top of people's minds. What do you think has gone so badly wrong for him?
Well, since its election, Macron has been attacked as the president of the rich. He's been object of a lot of demonstration and protests, such as the Yellow Vest. He's introduced a lot of policy reform, which tended to favor business groups and the upper classes. And his supporters come mainly from upper middle classes. Nevertheless, since 2019, he has managed to recover some kind of approval and support, and his voting intention are right now stable at around 25% of French voters. and the popularity of the president is up to 44%. So he has been improving over the last few years, and he still looks likely to be the winner of the French election against all possible other candidates.
What do you think is holding Emmanuel Macron back from publicly announcing his intention to run, considering we're only a couple of months away? As you said, his popularity rating is slightly improving in the opinion polls. Is there a possibility he may not run?
No, it's customary for French presidents to run and usually win a second term, except for particularly unpopular presidents. And I think that this is just a tactical move of Emmanuel Macron to time his official announcement at the most propitious moments in the next few weeks and months.
Well, we'll be holding our breath waiting for that. Can't talk about a French election, Paolo, and not mention Marine Le Pen. Pretty popular, obviously controversial, but certainly favoured by many. She was so close a few years ago. And looking at what happened here in the UK with Brexit led by Nigel Farage, do you think there are fears that she is a strong contender and perhaps France could be the next Britain? She certainly wants to pull the French out of the euro.
Marine Le Pen is tipped as the main alternative to Macron in the media and in opinion polls. Over the last few years, she has tried to adopt a more moderate profile, for instance, renaming her party from Front National to Rassemblement National, from National Front to National Rally. And she has also moderated her opposition to European integration. For example, in 2019, she has abandoned her previous plans to leave the euro, and she is now following an approach of renewing and reforming Europe without leaving it. Recently, she has been suffering a lot of competition on the right-hand side of the political spectrum with a former TV anchorman, Zemmour, raising on the far right, and also the traditional center-right party, Les Républicains, has nominated the new candidate, Valérie Pécresse. So right now there is a lot of competition on the center-right and right-wing side of the political spectrum, but she is still likely to qualify for the second round and lose in the second round to Emmanuel Macron, with a smaller lead compared to last time, but latest opinion polls are saying 56% for Macron, 44% for Le Pen.
Before I let you go, Paolo, because we're running out of time, I've got to ask you your opinions on France's recent presidency. They're taking over the rotating presidency of the European Union, considering, you know, there are still scars left from Brexit and we've got this election coming up in a couple of months. What is this presidency role going to do for the election, for Emmanuel Macron, for Europe that is still mourning the loss of Angela Merkel?
The 6 months rotating presidency for France will certainly offer Macron more opportunity to profile himself as an important statement, as Europe's leader, so to speak, but it's unlikely to shift many votes in the presidential election, as this is European integration is deemed to be a top issue by just 12% of the voters. So it's not really what springs to mind of French voters at the moment.
Well, absolutely. We're definitely going to have you back for more insights on this nail-biting election that's up and coming. Paolo Chiocchetti, a political scientist at the European University Institute. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Thanks, Paolo. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.